Does sensor speed matter? Every time a new camera comes out, it seems like there are very incremental changes to what's being upgraded. Maybe there's a new video mode or a new USB port, or in the case of Canon cameras, now it's full-size HDMI. But then there's always a note about how the sensor is so much better. Maybe the ISO performance has improved, or now it's a backside illuminated sensor or a stacked sensor. But then there's always a note in there about how the sensor has gotten so much faster. For most of us, a lot of these changes don't seem that impressive and are honestly features that we could live without. So the quick and short answer is maybe sensor speed matters, but the answer for you will depend on a few things that I hope to unpack in this video. But then also tell you why I'm personally excited about a lot of the new cameras that are coming out and about where camera tech is headed in these next couple of years. So here's a photo that I shot in my last video, and if you look close, you might be able to figure out one of the problems with this photo that was actually pointed out by one of you. So take a look, see if you can figure out what it is, maybe even leave a comment down below, and we'll come back to that photo in just a minute. So one of the ways that cameras can be fast is the shutter speed that you use. Whether it's 1/1000, 1/2000, 1/8000, the faster you crank that up, the more likely you will be to stop the motion or freeze the motion inside of your frame. There's also the amount of photos per second, or the burst speed that a camera can shoot in, whether that's 10 photos, 20 photos, or 40 photos per second. Cameras also have what's known as flash sync speed, and typically higher end cameras have a higher end flash sync speed, but a lot of cameras tend to top out at around 1/250, which is the maximum speed that a mechanical shutter can move before the two curtains, the top and the bottom, or the first and the second, start to narrow such that the entire sensor isn't fully exposed simultaneously. And if you want to know more about global shutter and mechanical shutter, I'll link a video at the end of this one that you might be interested in. There's also buffer size, or the speed of the buffer. Typically what that means is when you hold down and you shoot 40 photos per second and you're shooting in RAW, that buffer can fill up fast, or faster than it can dump to a memory card. So having a faster buffer or a larger buffer and faster memory cards means you'll be able to take more bursts and dump all those photos to your memory card at a faster speed. But then there's sensor readout, and it's really not a feature or spec that we talk about that often. But a lot of those other features depend on the speed of the sensor and also the resolution of the sensor, which kind of dictates also how fast a sensor can be. So take the Canon R1, for example. It's the latest camera from Canon. It's only 24 megapixels, which has a lot of people confused. Like, why is a flagship camera not 40 megapixels or 50 megapixels or 100 megapixels? And that's because the speed of the sensor is directly tied to the amount of megapixels, or the amount of data that that sensor needs to push. If there's more resolution, if there's more data, typically the sensor is slower. Now, another example is the Sony A9 Mark III, which is the first kind of photo camera that we've seen to implement a global shutter, which basically has the fastest shutter possible. But like the Canon R1, there are limitations with having a faster sensor, which means that both of these cameras, the Canon R1 and the Sony A9 Mark III, aren't necessarily the best options for your everyday shooter. But to appreciate how fast these cameras actually are, I think it helps to compare the speed of these sensors to the speed of a mechanical shutter, which is historically the fastest thing inside your camera. So taking a look at this chart, a mechanical shutter typically actuates at 1/250th of a second. That also happens to be the same speed as the flash sync speed, which, if we convert that into milliseconds, is 4 milliseconds. And if we take a look at some popular Sony and Canon cameras with the respective readout speeds of their sensors listed, you'll notice that some of these sensors are pretty slow. Like the Sony A7 IV, 67 milliseconds in photo, but then you compare that to the A9, which obviously has 0 milliseconds. On the Canon side, the R6 II, which is a lower resolution, has a faster readout than the higher resolution R5, but then the R5 II, which is now a stacked backside illuminated sensor, has an even faster shutter than both of those cameras. But it's still not quite as fast as the Canon R3 or the Canon R1, which has a 2.8 millisecond readout speed. And if you actually take a look at the flash sync speed on the new Canon R1, you'll notice that it's faster than 1/250th of a second. It's actually 1/400th of a second. And that's because that camera operates at its fastest speed in electronic shutter mode. So what that means is if your sensor readout is faster than a standard mechanical shutter, that 1/250th or that 4 milliseconds, it means you're actually going to be able to operate your camera faster in electronic shutter, because that is the fastest speed of the sensor versus the fastest possible speed of a mechanical rolling shutter. Or I believe the correct terminology is focal plane shutter. But then here's where it gets interesting. The new Nikon Z6III, sorry, I'm Canadian. But then if we take the Nikon Z6 III and put it into this list, you'll notice that the readout speed is about the same as the older Canon R6 II. So what's that all about? If we have a camera that's 2 years older being the same speed as a much newer camera with, an arguably faster sensor, how come it's not that much faster? That's because the Nikon Z6 III, much like the Canon R5 II and the Canon R1, now shoot electronic shutter in 14-bit, whereas the R6 II is shooting in 12-bit in electronic shutter. So it's something that is not that easy to understand when you look through the specs, and that's really why the Nikon Z6 III, the Canon R1, and the new Canon R5 Mark II are that impressive, because all of them are pushing electronic shutter in 14-bit, but are still maintaining those burst speeds, those photos per second, that we've come to expect from the previous generation of cameras. And at first that might not sound that impressive, like, oh, we only got 2 more bits going from 12 bits to 14 bits. But if you actually look at the amount of information contained within each bit, you can kind of think of bits as like pixels. It's how much information is contained within each pixel. But essentially, when you go from 12-bit to 14-bit, you're going from 4,000 bits of information per, or how do I explain this? 4,000 possible colors or tonal values in a pixel up to 16,000. So it's actually 4 times as much data. And this is where we maybe start to appreciate a lot of the engineering decisions that go into the cameras behind the scenes that we don't necessarily get to see. So then let's go back to that photo that I showed you. What is it about this photo that's so interesting? What is it that's so problematic? So the comment that I received on the short that I put out was that it was interesting to see the effects of rolling shutter. And when I first looked at this photo, I thought, what the heck? How can that be possible? I was panning and moving with the subject. But then I remembered I shot these photos in electronic shutter, which typically is more susceptible to rolling shutter effects. And so if we kind of draw a line here between the axle of the car and then the kind of center line of the finish line, you can see that they don't line up. And it's not that the driver was turning because this was a straightaway. What it means is that the sensor read out from top to bottom, left to right, and because it was moving so fast, I was panning, the car was moving, it's actually skewed the background. So if I was to correct this, let's say I shot this camera on a Sony A9 Mark III with a global shutter. Well, this is what that would look like. You would see a perfect alignment between the finish line and the axle and direction of the car. Versus, let's say I shot this camera on a Sony A7 IV in electronic shutter, which has a much more noticeable lag in the rolling shutter. It has slower readout. No offense to Sony shooters, it is an older camera at this point, but that's what that would look like. You would see much more skewing, much more distortion. And so for you, knowing these differences, knowing that a newer camera, a faster camera, a more expensive camera will reduce these effects of rolling shutter, what impact does this have on your photography? For some types of photography where there are no moving subjects, it really doesn't matter. This difference is the reason why a lot of photographers probably won't buy a Canon R1 or a Sony A9 Mark III. They don't see the benefits of spending that much just to correct distortion in a rare circumstance like this. But sensor speed comes with a lot of other benefits like more dynamic range. It also means now we get 14-bit in electronic shutter, which is absolutely awesome if you're someone who does safari photography or wildlife photography, where you need your camera to be silent, meaning the mechanical shutter doesn't move, but then you still get access to all of the dynamic range of your camera sensor. So when it comes to new cameras, sometimes it seems like the changes aren't that impressive or are very incremental. But when you look at the speeds of some of these older cameras to some of these newer cameras and realize that not only is the speed increasing, but it also means now we're jumping from 12-bit to 14-bit in electronic shutter, these changes are actually quite impressive. So hopefully you found this somewhat informative and learned something about bit depth and the speed of camera sensors. If you did, let me know down in the comments below. And if you want to see more videos like this, I guess you can check out some of these videos right here. And until the next one, grab your camera, get out, and go shoot photos.